Lucas Hammond returned to Cedar Grove expecting crisp air, quiet walks, and Dutch apple pie, not a neon orange warning on his windshield. He had barely stepped out of the old family Honda when he noticed it, flapping against the wiper like it belonged more to a crime scene than a suburban driveway. The color practically hummed against the early autumn haze. Lucas tugged it free with 2 fingers, eyes narrowing. Unregistered vehicle, subject to tow. No greeting. No warning. Just bold block letters and a deadline. The ink smelled fresh, like someone had only recently walked away. The breeze carried the scent of chimney smoke and mown grass. He turned toward the house. The clapboard siding needed painting. The mailbox still leaned slightly from the last freeze. His childhood front yard hadn't changed much in 2 decades. But apparently the rules had. From the front porch, his father leaned on the rail, coffee cup in hand, expression unreadable. "Welcome home," Frank said, voice dry as the September wind. Lucas held up the notice like a surrendered flag. "This come with the pie, or is it a seasonal special?" Frank sipped. "Some folks confuse rules with rights. We'll sort it." The interior of the house smelled like cedar and furniture polish. The same radio that once played Sunday jazz now rested mute beneath a dust cloth. Lucas dropped his bag by the coat rack and stepped into the kitchen, the floor creaking under his boots. His father already had a folder open on the table. "Donna Lively. New vice chair of the HOA. Runs it like a school board with delusions." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Is she the one who ticketed me?" Frank nodded. "She's the one who tickets everyone." Lucas sighed and leaned back against the fridge. "I took a sabbatical to avoid spreadsheets and middle management. This feels personal." Frank didn't answer immediately. He flipped a page and set his mug down. "Go take a walk. Lou's diner is still standing. Mabel's usually there by 9. It wasn't advice, it was choreography. Lucas knew the steps. The bell above the diner door jingled just like it did when he was 13 and ordering pancakes with extra syrup. Nothing had changed but the menu prices. Inside, the smell of crisp bacon and fresh percolated coffee curled through the air like old friends. Mabel Ackers sat at the corner booth, her gray hair tucked neatly beneath a knit beret. She looked up from the newspaper when Lucas approached and smiled with something like recognition. "You're Frank's boy," she said. "Thought I saw that car in the driveway." Lucas slid into the booth across from her. "Apparently my car offends the moral sensibilities of this neighborhood." Mabel's smile turned sly. "Let me guess. Neon ticket? Donna's handwriting? Block letters and all caps. Subtle as a marching band." She chuckled and buttered her toast. "She fined me once for planting marigolds. Said they weren't on the approved flora list. I told her I'd start growing plastic if she wanted it that fake." The waitress came by, topped off Mabel's cup, and gave Lucas a half-smile. "Welcome back, sugar. You still take your coffee like your dad, black and stubborn?" Lucas nodded. "More stubborn these days." When the waitress left, Mabel leaned in. "Donna thinks she's preserving order. What she's preserving is her ego." Lucas stared out the window. The leaves along Main Street had just begun to bronze. Across the way, Walt Barrow sat outside the hardware store, whittling a piece of cedar into the vague shape of a duck. He glanced up and waved with the same 2 fingers he used to hold his pipe 30 years ago. Mabel followed his gaze. "Walt says HOA used to be neighbors helping each other repaint fences. Now it's bylaws and power trips." Lucas pushed back from the booth. "That parking lot down on Maple, does the HOA actually own it?" Mabel shrugged. "They say they do." That was enough. By the time he got back to the house, Frank was in the garage, elbow deep in a metal filing cabinet labeled in neat script, "Township, Contracts, prior to 2005. Lucas leaned against the doorframe. "Didn't peg you for a paper hoarder." Frank grunted. "I kept what mattered. And I don't trust digital memory. It forgets faster." He pulled out a yellow folder, dust motes spiraling in the overhead light. Civic contracts, parking, it read in faded ink. He opened it slowly, like flipping through old war files. Lucas watched his father's eyes scan the pages. There was a moment of stillness, then a subtle lift of the corner of his mouth. Frank smiled and said, "This could get fun. Some people retire and fish." Frank Hammond keeps records, and knows when a lease is about to expire. Lucas stood just inside the garage, watching his father maneuver like a man 10 years younger through a forest of shelves, cardboard boxes, and file drawers. Every cabinet was labeled in a precise hand: zoning, 1981 to 2000, public works, easements and rights-of-way. The chaos had its own internal system. Somewhere among rusted screw jars and yellowed blueprints, Frank was on a hunt. "They never expected anyone to keep paper copies," Frank said, flipping open a metal binder. "That was their first mistake." Lucas lifted an old garden chair off a crate and Saturday, "Remind me again why we're doing this in your garage instead of using the internet." "Because the internet doesn't remember when a clause got quietly omitted in 2004. Frank pulled out a folder and turned to a page marked with a bent paperclip. "But I do." The sheet inside was crisp, original, municipal letterhead from 1998. A lease agreement, Cedar Grove HOA and the township. Public lot on Maple Avenue. 25 years. No automatic renewal. Lucas leaned closer. "That means it expired." "Last quarter," Frank said. 90 days ago. And no one filed for extension." A beat passed. "That makes the lot open for bid," Frank added. "If someone claims it first." Lucas let the weight of it settle in. Outside, a dog barked lazily. A truck drove by, slow and indifferent. The world hadn't changed yet, but the gears had begun turning. They made their way to town hall just after lunch, where the building smelled faintly of wax tile and artificial pine cleaner. The clerk's office had a bell on the counter and a candy jar half filled with butterscotches. Behind the desk, Ruthie Delgado looked up from a jigsaw puzzle with a warm, conspiratorial smile. "Frank Hammond," she said, standing. "The last man in town who still fills out forms in triplicate." He tipped his cap, and Lucas introduced himself. Ruthie reached for a worn folder and nodded knowingly. "You're here about the maple lot." Frank's eyebrows twitched. "That obvious?" "I saw the HOA minutes last month," she said, lowering her voice. "No mention of lease renewal. Not even a draft request. Donna's been busy with benches and flower pots. Forgot the foundation." She handed Frank a clipboard. "I assume you want to register intent?" "Officially," Frank said, pulling a black pen from his breast pocket like a soldier sheathing a bayonet. As he signed, Ruthie rummaged behind the counter and returned with a small plastic container. "Butter cookies," she said, "homemade, not those dry store-bought things." Lucas accepted one out of politeness. It crumbled perfectly. "Has the HOA asked about reapplying?" he asked. Ruthie shook her head. "Not once. They just assume things keep rolling if they don't rock the boat." Frank handed the completed form across the counter. "Well," he said, "they're about to hit a wave." Later that afternoon, they stopped by Lou's Diner for coffee. The booths were half filled with regulars, the kind who didn't order but whose food always showed up the same way. The waitress, Ruthie's cousin by marriage, greeted Frank like an old road sign, seen often, rarely cleaned. They took the booth by the window. Lucas stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, watching traffic nudge past on Main Street. Across from him, Frank sat quiet, folding the lease paperwork like a blueprint. Carl Neely passed by their table with a to-go cup in one hand and his wallet in the other. The HOA treasurer looked like he hadn't slept much, shirt wrinkled, collar off-center. He paused when he noticed them. "Afternoon, Frank." "Lucas." His voice was thin but polite. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon." "Just visiting," Lucas said smoothly, then added, "You still handling property records for the board?" Carl nodded, shifting uncomfortably. "More or less. Budget's tight. Frank didn't look up. So tight you forgot to renew a 25-year lease? Carl blinked. I'm sorry. Lucas smiled gently. The Maple Lot. I imagine it's a little awkward when your anchor space slips anchor. Carl looked between them and stepped back, clutching his cup like a lifeline. I'm sure Donna has it under review. He turned and left with something close to haste, bumping the door with his shoulder on the way out. Lucas sipped his coffee. You think he'll warn her? Frank replied, let him. Won't change a thing. They lingered a while. At the booth behind them, someone was talking about leaf cleanup. Two men at the counter debated whether the high school team could win this season. Outside, the streetlights began to flicker against the darkening sky. Lucas leaned back. What now? Before Frank could answer, the bell above the door jingled again. Donna Lively walked in, heels clicking, clipboard in hand. She didn't look toward them at first, but her eyes caught Carl's empty seat, then traced the room until they landed on Frank. He nodded once. She did not smile. Lucas watched her pivot sharply and head to the counter, placing a fast order. She looked different under fluorescent light, less commanding, more rushed. Maybe it was the way her mouth tightened when she heard laughter from their booth. Maybe it was the fact that for the first time, she looked like someone trying to catch up. Frank quietly says, they assumed too much. Now they pay for that. Lucas asks, so what's the plan? Frank answers, let's buy a little inconvenience. You don't need to raise your voice when you have the deed in your hand. The town hall's meeting room smelled faintly of dust, wood polish, and those soft erasers you only ever saw on clerk desks. Fluorescent lights buzzed above, half-heartedly illuminating rows of chairs arranged in neat lines. It was October 1st, and outside, the sky hung low with the kind of heavy clouds that made you forget sunlight existed. Frank sat near the front, pen clipped to the inside of his jacket. Lucas, a row behind, scanned the room slowly. There were more people here than he expected for a property auction, some out of habit, others out of curiosity. A few simply enjoyed the formality of the thing, as if governance were a civic theater. Ruthie Delgado stood at the podium, clipboard in hand, reading off parcel numbers in her usual calm cadence. When she reached lot number 13, Maple Avenue Municipal Lot, her tone didn't change, but her eyes did. They flicked up, found Frank, and lingered a moment. Opening bid, she called, $500. Someone in the second row raised a hand. Then Frank raised his. Bids climbed, incrementally, cautiously. Carl Neely, seated at the side with a few HOA folders in his lap, looked increasingly pale with each nod from Frank. Donna wasn't in the room, but her shadow certainly was, hovering over every twitch Carl made. At $1,400, the second bidder hesitated. Frank lifted his hand again. Ruthie didn't blink. $1,500. Do I hear 16? Silence. The gavel hit the podium with a soft knock. Sold, Ruthie said. To Franklin Hammond. Transaction pending recording and payment. There was no applause. Just a subtle shifting of weight, some polite nods, and a few raised brows. Lucas exhaled slowly, then stood to meet his father outside. On the courthouse steps, fallen leaves swirled in lazy circles. Frank pulled a folded envelope from his coat and handed it to Ruthie. All there, he said. She glanced at it, then smiled. They're going to call me first, you know. Frank nodded. Tell them I was courteous. That evening, the HOA board received a couriered letter, thick cardstock, neat legalese, embossed seal. The language was unmistakable, the lease was expired, rights to the property had been lawfully transferred to a private holding entity, and the HOA's continued use of the lot would now incur a monthly rent of $2,100, payable in advance. The new landlord, Hammond and Company, LLC. Lucas was at the diner when the news broke. He didn't need to read the letter, he saw it in the expressions of those who had. Donna entered just as he was folding his napkin. Conversations around the booths slowed but didn't stop. She made eye contact with no one, only scanned the room as if trying to detect a leak in the ceiling. At the counter, Mabel nudged a sugar packet across the laminate and said to Lucas, "About time someone poked the bear." He smiled faintly. "You think it'll roar?" "She'll roar," Mabel said. But no teeth left. Outside, Carl caught Lucas near the parking meter, shifting from foot to foot. "You really went through with it," he said, not accusing, not admiring, just trying to understand. Lucas didn't blink. "Wasn't personal." Carl nodded slowly. "Not yet." Later that night, Lucas walked past the maple lot. A new sign stood at its edge, simple, polished, professionally installed. "Private property, inquiries? See Hammond and Company." Its starkness drew attention not by size, but by certainty. No clip art, no cheery font. Just facts. At the church potluck that Sunday, an older woman asked Walt Barrow whether the board had cleared parking for next week's quilting circle. At the library, the front desk clerk muttered about having to move the book fair tables closer to the curb. At the market, someone joked that even the pumpkins were nervous. Whispers carried better in a small town than megaphones. Donna pulled up to the lot just before dusk, stepping out in slacks and a vest too crisp for the hour. She looked at the sign, at the gravel, at the cars parked nearby like uninvited guests. Then she saw Frank standing a dozen feet away, hands in his pockets, just watching. She didn't say a word. Frank says, "And that's check." The Fall Street Fair was a week away, and the HOA had nowhere to park their pride. The mailbox at Lucas's family home was stuffed with glossy flyers, each boasting bold fonts and photos of smiling children beside pumpkins. Cedar Grove Fall Fair, October 8th, they read, promising homemade pies, live bluegrass, and a raffle for a cord of firewood. But none of them mentioned parking. At the HOA office, wedged awkwardly beside a nail salon in the old mill strip, Donna Lively was pacing. The walls were cluttered with laminated posters of past events and framed photos of Donna herself shaking hands with prize-winning chili chefs. A stack of invoices teetered on the edge of the conference table. "We just need a temporary agreement," she said, her voice tight but level. "It's 1 week." Carl Neely looked up from a spreadsheet with the caution of someone who knew better than to volunteer. Frank's response was clear. "Full rent. No exceptions." Donna slapped a palm against the stack. "Then raise dues. Emergency assessment. One-time fee." Carl grimaced. "You do realize most folks think we already charge too much?" She ignored him, tapping a pencil against her clipboard. "Send the notice. Today." By mid-morning, HOA members across Cedar Grove found slips in their mailboxes, special fair maintenance contribution, $45 due immediately. No explanation. No vote. Just a deadline. At Lou's Diner, the reaction was swift. "Heard they're charging us to fund a parking space they don't own," muttered someone at the counter. "More like a panic tax," Walt said, stirring his coffee with the handle of his spoon. Lucas sipped his cup from a back booth, half listening. He'd already heard from Linda Kerr that morning, twice. She burst into the diner, coat barely on, cheeks flushed. "Lucas, I've got 10 vendors who haven't been assigned spots. What's going on?" He gestured for her to sit, which she did with a clatter. "I thought the HOA reserved the maple lot," she said, glancing around. "I mean, they always do." Lucas folded his hands. "Not this year." Linda blinked. "But where am I supposed to put the kettle corn stand?" "Maybe talk to the HOA." Linda stared at him, then leaned in. "You're enjoying this." "Not as much as you think," he said quietly. "But I do like watching people face their own shortcuts." Back on Maple Avenue, Frank had spent the morning with a local sign maker, an old friend from his city planning days. By noon, 3 hand-carved cedar signs stood at equal intervals along the lot's perimeter. The lettering was crisp, understated. Private, no HOA access, inquiries, Hammond & Co. No sarcasm. No fuss. Just presence. Donna drove past later that afternoon in her compact sedan, braking hard at the middle sign. She got out, stood still for a long moment, and then returned to her car without touching the post. At home, Lucas found Mabel waiting on the porch, holding a weathered canvas tote. "These," she said, handing it over, "are from 2014 to 2019. I stopped printing them once they switched to email." Inside were folded HOA newsletters, receipts, and 2 typed pages labeled unaudited expenditures. Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Some of us noticed the balloon arch budget tripled without explanation," Mabel said. "That was the year Donna hired professionals." He laughed under his breath and motioned toward the kitchen. "You want coffee?" "I brought stew," she replied. "And you need to eat something that didn't come from a box." While the slow cooker filled the room with the scent of beef and carrots, Mabel flipped through a few papers, pointing at handwritten notes. "These are mine. Back when they still let me see the books." Lucas glanced at a line item, "Fair parking, $0." He nodded slowly. On Friday afternoon, Frank stood by the edge of the lot, watching as the deadline for rent passed without a check or email. No attempt. No negotiation. By Saturday, the signs remained. Vendors had begun calling Linda directly, confused. Some offered to pay for spots themselves. She told them she didn't have authority. The HOA hadn't given her any answers. Sunday morning, after service, several seniors gathered around the bake sale table and speculated openly. "My grandson says they can't even use the library overflow lot," one said. "The board didn't ask. Thought they didn't have to. I liked it better when Harold ran the fair. He got permission for everything." Back at the diner, Walt passed Lucas a folded newspaper clipping. "Editorial from '99, he said. "Whole town fought over a gazebo. We survived." Lucas smiled. "This isn't a gazebo." "No," Walt said, "it's your move." At 5 p.m., the lot officially closed to HOA use. Frank posted a notice by the edge of the sidewalk. "Use of this lot without agreement constitutes trespassing. Contact 5550142. Just before dusk, Donna returned. She stepped from her car with a deliberate gait, lips pursed. She walked up to the middle sign and stared for a full minute. Lucas watched her from across the street, standing beside a newspaper stand. She didn't say a word until she turned to go. Then, over her shoulder, her voice clipped the air like a blade. "You're going to regret this." In Cedar Grove, news travels faster than trucks on Main Street, and this time, it had a headline. The community bulletin board outside Lou's Diner had grown crowded in recent weeks: fall cleanup notices, leaf-raking services, bake sale flyers, but none of them stirred quite the same buzz as the new sheet thumbtack dead center, a printout of an upcoming feature from the Cedar Gazette. Its title, in bold serif. "Whose lot is it anyway? Hammond vs. HOA." By the time the paper dropped, nearly everyone in town had heard a version of the story, some true, some embroidered. But the article itself had weight. It had names. It had dates. And for the first time, it had an outside voice. That voice belonged to Grace Yoon. She showed up quietly, no camera crew, no notebook waved in faces. Just a soft-spoken woman in her mid-30s, hair pulled back in a neat bun, a canvas satchel slung over her shoulder. She asked questions the way a good reporter should, gently, persistently, respectfully. Her first stop was Mabel Ackers's porch. Grace listened while Mabel served hot cider and recounted a decade of bylaw inconsistencies, complete with color-coded tabs. The binder she handed over had been assembled during years of being ignored. Now, finally, it had an audience. Mabel once said, "Write it down. Sooner or later, it speaks louder than voices." Grace nodded as she tucked the binder into her bag. "This helps more than you know." Lucas met Grace the next morning by the benches outside the post office. The wind had sharpened, and a few early leaves scuttled around their feet. "I understand if you don't want to be quoted," she said after introductions. "But I wanted to hear from you directly." He studied her face, measured, patient. Not chasing a scoop. Just chasing clarity. I'll say this, he replied after a pause. I'm not interested in drama. But people deserve to know what's being done in their name, and with their money. Grace nodded. Fair enough. They sat a while longer, watching two kids argue over who got to hold a pumpkin. The older one won, of course, but offered to share the stem. By the following day, Donna had called an unscheduled HOA meeting. She spoke in clipped tones, eyes darting to her phone more than the faces in front of her. No one speaks to the press, she snapped. This is coordinated. This is targeted. Carl Neely, seated at the far end of the table, cleared his throat. Did we really spend $1,200 on table centerpieces last year? Donna didn't answer. Carl glanced at a spreadsheet in his hand. Because I never signed off on that. And I don't remember voting on the DJ for the pancake breakfast either. Someone coughed. Another shifted in their chair. Donna straightened. This is not the time to nitpick expenses. We're under siege. Outside, Grace leaned casually against her car, tapping notes into her phone. She wasn't close enough to hear the meeting, but the body language said enough. That Friday, the Cedar Gazette hit front porches and wire racks. The headline stood proud above the fold. Grace's article was careful, measured but firm. It detailed the expired lease, the new ownership, the rate hikes, the unanswered letters. It included a timeline of board decisions. And it ended with a question. When oversight fades into assumption, who really owns the spaces we all use? By lunchtime, the diner was packed. Lucas walked in and immediately felt the shift. People didn't stop talking, but they paused long enough to look. Some nodded. A few offered half smiles. Walt raised his mug from the corner booth like a salute. At the counter, Mrs. Lipton from the library leaned over her grilled cheese and said, "You know, I always thought the HOA had too much say. I just didn't think anyone would do anything about it." Lucas smiled faintly. Sometimes doing something starts with reading the fine print. From across the room, Mabel waved him over and handed him a manila envelope. Photos, she said. Old ones. Back when the lot was really public. Might help the next round. He thanked her and slid into the booth. Outside, Donna sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel. The paper was open on the passenger seat. She'd highlighted 3 paragraphs. One name circled in red, Frank Hammond. That evening, the Hammond mailbox held a neatly folded envelope. Inside, a letter with HOA letterhead declared Frank's behavior unbecoming of a resident and cited intentional harassment and disruption of community operations. It ended with a warning: further actions could prompt legal review. Lucas read it aloud in the kitchen, then handed it to Frank. His father raised an eyebrow. Well, Frank said, they just made it public. The pie contest had a trophy. The HOA had a tent. Neither had a place to park. Main Street was already buzzing by 8:30 a.m., lined with pumpkin displays, checkered tablecloths, and signs promising everything from apple butter to hayrides. The Fall Street Fair was the kind of small-town celebration that made people believe, for a few hours, that the world hadn't changed much since 1952. But there was a problem, and it arrived on wheels. Cars jammed the side streets. Vendor vans circled twice, 3 times, then idled near corners with blinkers on and drivers frowning through windshields. Someone pointed toward the maple lot. Another shook their head. The cedar signs stood crisp and unmoving, a quiet fence around the chaos. Donna Lively stood near the fair's main tent, clipboard in hand, teeth tight behind a fixed smile. Linda Kerr was mid-rant beside her, waving a map that now felt more like fiction. "You told me we'd have access." Linda snapped. Donna hissed back, "We do. It's always been implied." "It's not implied if it's locked." Linda fired. "People are unloading on lawns." Donna gestured toward the hill behind the community center. "The grass lot. We've used it before." Linda crossed her arms. It rained all Thursday. That field soup. Indeed, the first attempt to divert a kettle corn trailer up the slope had ended in tire spin and one mud-covered volunteer. Lucas and Frank arrived on foot, each holding steaming cups of cider. Frank wore his navy windbreaker, Lucas a plaid scarf Mabel had knitted years ago. They nodded at familiar faces, waved to Walt who manned the trivia wheel, and paused near the Hammond and Company signs. Vendors stared at the lot from behind crates and bundled cords, their expressions not angry, just tired of guessing. Grace Yoon knelt by one of the cedar posts, snapping a photo while a vendor in an apron gestured behind her, explaining how she'd driven in circles since dawn. Lucas caught her eye. Grace gave a subtle nod and turned back to frame the sign and the huddle of confused artisans in the background. Over near the pie booth, two older men in suspenders debated which entry looked least store-bought, while kids painted mini pumpkins at a table splattered with orange and glitter. The bluegrass band tuned their banjos under the library's eaves, trying to stay out of the breeze. Then the murmurs started. Why isn't parking marked? Didn't the HOA handle this? I paid my dues, where did they go? Donna, halfway through an interview with the local radio rep, caught the shift too late. Voices were rising. Not yelling, but close. A wave, not a shout. Linda, red in the face, turned to her. You assured me. I was told the lot was public, Donna replied, her tone sharper than she intended. You weren't told, Linda snapped. You assumed. At the cider tent, Walt muttered, built their fare on borrowed ground. Let's see them try to hold it up. Frank chuckled under his breath and took another sip. Carl Neely stepped up onto the small wooden stage near the square's center. He held no clipboard, no folder, just a folded paper and a microphone. He tapped it once, gently. Morning, everyone, he said, his voice steadier than usual. Before we kick off the pie judging, I think we need to talk. Not about desserts, but about something less sweet, transparency. The sound system crackled. Donna turned sharply toward him. Carl, this isn't the time. But people were already looking up. Grace pointed her camera. Carl adjusted his glasses. I've been treasurer for 4 years. I've signed a lot of checks. And I've started asking where some of them actually went. Donna's face flushed red. Her clipboard slipped slightly in her grip. Lucas watched from beside the cider stand, cider cooling in his hands. Around him, neighbors leaned closer. Heads turned, boots shuffled in leaves. Questions had already been asked in whispers, now they were being asked into microphones. A reporter's camera flash caught the moment mid-collapse. The folding chairs were packed tight, the coffee lukewarm, and the silence before the first accusation was louder than fireworks. The Cedar Grove Community Center hadn't seen this many people since the high school swing band fundraiser back in 2015. Rows of chairs creaked under winter coats and crossed arms. The fluorescent lights above flickered every so often, humming like they were struggling to keep up with the tension in the room. At the back, someone passed around a tin of cough drops. A man in suspenders near the exit continued knitting slowly, as if his fingers knew that calm was something you brought with you. Frank sat 2 rows from the front, Lucas beside him. Grace Yoon stood off to the side with a small projector, her folders labeled, papers organized, calm as ever. Donna Lively hovered behind the folding table at the front, her mouth taut, eyes scanning. Carl Neely stood and tapped the mic. Thank you for coming, he said, voice clear despite the echo. Tonight's meeting was called by member request. We'll be discussing recent concerns about spending, decisions, and the structure of this board. A few heads nodded. A woman near the middle adjusted her glasses. From the back row, Mabel whispered something to Kyle Raymond, the youngest member of the HOA board, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Carl gestured toward Grace. We've invited an outside journalist who's reviewed our documents. Grace, if you would. Grace stepped forward without fanfare. Thank you, she said. I was asked to look into the HOA's public records. What I found is, well, concerning. She held up a page. This is a receipt for decorative lighting from last winter, $1,800. It was purchased without a vote, approved solely by the chair. She clicked to the next slide. This is a lease agreement for the Maple Avenue lot, expired, not renewed, and yet presented as valid during dues collection. Eyes flicked to Donna. Every significant expense in the past 2 years, Grace continued, carries one common signature. Donna's name, projected on the wall, hung longer than the slide lasted. Kyle stood slowly. I'm on the board, he said, voice trembling. I signed documents, too. But I didn't understand most of them. I just trusted what I was told. Donna's lips pressed white. From the back, Mabel stood. When we wrote the bylaws, she said gently, it was about snowplow fees and repainting signs. Not fencing off the town from itself. She held up a brittle copy of the original charter. We weren't supposed to manage people, we were supposed to serve them. Frank rose next, adjusting his glasses. Power without stewardship becomes control. And that's not community. That's command. Donna stepped forward then, her voice sharp, cutting through the air. This is a vendetta, she said. I've worked for this community for over a decade. And now outsiders, grudge-bearers, and saboteurs want to tear it down. She turned toward Lucas. You never cared before this. You moved in and started digging. Why? Lucas stayed seated. Because the digging uncovered something real. Donna shook her head. None of you understand what it takes to keep this place livable. What we've done, what I've done, was to preserve order. A woman in the third row stood. Order. Or control. Then a father with 2 toddlers in his lap, I paid dues. But my questions never got answers. A retired librarian, you changed the rules without meetings. One voice after another, a rising murmur of polite rebellion. Not shouting, but no longer quiet. Carl lifted a hand. We'll take a motion, he said. A vote of no confidence in the chair. Several people raised their hands before he'd finished the sentence. Those in favor? The forest of hands that rose was slow but steady. Some unsure, others certain. Kyle's was the last to go up. Donna stood frozen. Her hand clenched the back of the folding chair. Then, without a word, she stepped out from behind the table, walked down the aisle between the chairs, and exited into the cold night. Nobody followed. Lucas turned to Frank. Is this really over? Frank replies, no. Now it begins, for the right reasons. The new parking sign didn't have HOA branding. It just said, welcome. It stood on a cedar post near the edge of the lot, where the gravel met fresh asphalt. Hand-painted, soft gray letters, a simple blue border, and a small wooden flower stenciled in one corner. Below it, 2 sturdy benches faced the street, one donated by the garden club, the other by the Rotary. The lot itself was newly lined, wide enough for pickups and minivans, and free from the tangle of signs that used to dictate how long you could stay or which direction to enter. Lucas capped the last paint line and stepped back, squinting against the morning sun. A gust of wind scattered a few leftover leaves across the asphalt. Behind him, the folding table near Lou's diner was already gathering a crowd, thermoses steaming, paper plates stacked beside boxes of still warm donuts. Frank approached with 2 cups of coffee, one in each hand. Cream in yours, right? Lucas took the cup. You always ask, but you never forget. I like to give the illusion of democracy. They stood for a while, watching as neighbors filed in, some elderly, some with strollers, a few teenagers still shaking off the sleep of Saturday. Mabel brought a tin of oatmeal muffins, Walt arrived with the crossword section of the Gazette folded under one arm, and someone had set up a Bluetooth speaker playing gentle bluegrass. Kyle Raymond stood beside the sign, talking to Mrs. Dellinger from the hardware store about snow shoveling grants. His shoulders looked a little less hunched than usual. His new role on the HOA board hadn't made him louder, but it had made him more present. Frank nodded toward him. He's learning fast. Better than fast, Lucas said. He's listening. Near the benches, Mabel knelt beside a low wooden post. She took her time unwrapping the linen cloth around a small plaque. Walt handed her a screwdriver from the bench. With slow, careful turns, she mounted the piece beneath the welcome sign. Lucas moved closer to read the carving. Respect makes space. For cars, and for people. Frank stepped beside him. She wrote that back when the bylaws were just being drafted. It sat in her drawer for years. Lucas smiled. Some things age into meaning. At the far table, Grace Yoon arrived with a folded newspaper in hand. She waved, then passed Lucas a copy. How a Small Town Stood Tall. By Grace Yoon. He skimmed the first paragraph. It wasn't flashy, just clear. About the lot. The vote. The rebuild. But mostly about the people. I thought you'd left already, he said. I did. But I drove back this morning. Couldn't resist a town with homemade stew and soft news worth writing. He held up the cup. Refills are free if you bring gossip. Grace grinned. I'll trade for donut holes. Frank joined a small circle trading Sunday heating tips, who was switching to pellet, who still swore by firewood. A pair of twins played hopscotch near the library planter. The aroma of cinnamon and coffee hung over the sidewalk like a shared breath. Lucas looked across the lot, now half full, vendors dropping off supplies, a few older couples parking before heading to the thrift sale. No ticket writers. No stern notices. Just people coming and going. Grace pointed toward a wooden stall being assembled near the sidewalk. What's that? Digital repair stand, Lucas said. I figured if I'm sticking around, might as well help folks fix their printers and tangled passwords. Extending your sabbatical? He nodded. Turns out I like seeing who I'm helping. The breeze picked up, rustling the sign above them. The word welcome swayed gently, catching the light. No more fines. No more whisper rules. Just warm cider, solved puzzles passed down the bench, and room for everyone to park. On a quiet November morning in Cedar Grove, a simple wooden sign replaced years of silence. It didn't threaten, restrict, or fine. It welcomed. What began as one man's return home became a gentle but unyielding stand for fairness, reminding the town that real authority isn't enforced, it's earned. When rules serve people, they protect. When they serve power, they must be questioned. Like the last light warming a front porch at dusk, even the smallest stand can help a community find its way back to itself.